Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We'll now begin with Story 1, The Dawn of Revolution, the financial crisis of the French crown. France, 1786. You awaken in a country ruled by absolute monarchy, where every edict flows from the lips of Louis XVI. But beneath the gold of Versailles, France is rotting. Not from revolution yet, but from debt, inefficiency, and a centuries-old system that no longer fits the world it rules. The kingdom, magnificent to the eye, is broke. A deep hole of debt. At the heart of the coming upheaval lies a simple truth: France had no money. By the 1780s, the French crown had accumulated an enormous national debt, much of it due to extravagant military spending, most notably France's support for the American Revolutionary War. While American liberty gained a new star, France accrued nothing but receipts. Add to that the lavish expenditures of the royal household, and you had a nation living far beyond its means. Versailles alone, with its fountains, feasts, and forests of crystal chandeliers, was a monument to excess. No single palace represented the financial mismanagement of the ancient regime quite like it. The cost of maintaining royal dignity, hundreds of millions of livres. Meanwhile, French peasants and artisans struggled to afford bread. Taxation, a system designed to fail. France's taxation system was as lopsided as its social hierarchy. The first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, the nobility, were largely exempt from taxes. The third estate, composed of everyone else, from poor peasants to wealthy merchants, bore the full weight of the fiscal burden. But even within the third estate, the tax system was a maze. There were the taille, a direct land tax; the gabelle, a salt tax; corvée labor, mandatory unpaid work; tithes paid to the church; and countless regional tariffs and local duties. Tax collection was farmed out to private agents, the fermiers gagnants who made fortunes exploiting inefficiencies. They often collected more than required, pocketing the difference. The result: France's richest citizens paid the least and its poorest paid the most. Necker and the illusion of prosperity. To the common eye, things didn't seem too terrible at first. That's thanks in part to Jacques Necker, Louis XVI's finance minister. Necker's masterstroke was a public report on royal finances, a first in French history. The Compte rendu au roi, 1781, claimed that France's finances were in decent shape. It was an illusion. The report excluded war debt. It was designed for public reassurance, not fiscal reform. Necker was immensely popular among the Third Estate for his apparent transparency and mild reforms, but among the nobility and court insiders he was despised. Eventually he was dismissed, then recalled, then dismissed again. His presence and absence would both come to signal instability. Versailles, theater of denial. Even as the nation teetered toward bankruptcy, Versailles remained oblivious. Royal spending continued unabated. Court culture demanded constant display: new gowns, new jewels, elaborate balls, endless dinners. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, earned the moniker Madame Deficit not because she controlled the budget, but because she symbolized waste. She retreated to her private hamlet at the Petit Trianon, playing shepherdess while real shepherds across France faced famine. It was symbolic indulgence, harmless in action, but politically devastating. And when the crown finally attempted to levy new taxes on the nobility, the backlash was swift and furious. The Assembly of Notables, a gathering of the privileged. In 1787, the king convened the Assembly of Notables, hoping the aristocracy might consent to tax reforms. It was not a parliament, it had no legislative power, but rather a council of nobles and clergy gathered to lend support to the crown's policies. It backfired. The notables refused. Many believed the king should call the Estates General, which hadn't met since 1614, to approve such sweeping changes. They sensed weakness and they seized it. This resistance shocked Louis XVI. For the first time, the authority of absolute monarchy was not absolute at all. The peasant's plight. Meanwhile, France's countryside faced terrible harvests. In 1788, hailstorms and floods devastated crops. By 1789, bread prices doubled, then tripled. For a laborer earning just a few sous per day, this spelled disaster. Bread wasn't just food, it was survival. As grain reserves dwindled, hunger spread. Bakeries were raided. Women lined up in the pre-dawn dark to buy loaves they might never see. In the cities, unrest simmered, not yet revolutionary but desperate. In taverns and salons, whispers began to grow. Why does the king have so much and we so little? Failure of the reforms. Between 1786 and 1789, three different finance ministers, Calonne, Brienne, and Necker, again tried to fix the crisis. All failed. Their proposals cutting exemptions, creating new land taxes, regulating the budget were met with resistance from all sides. Reform was either too timid for real change or too radical for the privileged to accept. Worse still, the government had no centralized budget process. Ministers didn't even agree on what the actual deficit was. By 1789, France was essentially insolvent. It could not pay its debts, fund its government, or feed its people. An invitation to revolution. With the country in collapse and the privileged refusing to sacrifice, Louis XVI made a decision that would change history. He agreed to convene the Estates General. It was a desperate move, but in doing so, he opened the door to public political discourse, to representation, to debate all concepts long suppressed by monarchy. He believed it would contain the crisis. He was wrong. Closing reflection. How did a kingdom with so much wealth, power, and tradition become so vulnerable to collapse, not from foreign invasion or plague, but from debt and bureaucratic inertia? And what might have happened if the privileged had chosen reform over resistance? The decision had been made. After a gap of 175 years, France would convene the Estates General. But what did that really mean? Most people alive in 1789 had never seen an Estates General session in their lifetimes. It was a relic of medieval governance, long buried by the heavy hand of absolutist monarchy. Yet now, like a forgotten tool rediscovered in a crumbling barn, it was being dusted off and set into motion. It was a move born of desperation, not vision. And yet, in unlocking that long-closed door, Louis XVI unknowingly invited the nation to rewrite itself. Preparing the cahiers d'alliances. Before the Estates General could meet, France's three estates were invited to compile lists of grievances, known as cahiers d'alliances. Every town, every parish, every district would submit their voices to the crown on paper. And so, across France, scribes, priests, and notaries set to work, collecting thousands of handwritten pages. They recorded complaints about unfair taxation, grain shortages and famine, the privileges of the nobility, judicial corruption, the abuses of local seigneurs, the heavy hand of church tithes, calls for a constitution, press freedom, and equal rights. Even the First and Second Estates often echoed calls for reform, though seldom for equality. Some nobles, especially liberal ones like the Duke of Orleans, voiced support for meritocracy and curtailing the monarchy. But among the Third Estate, something far more radical was brewing: the rise of political literacy. For decades, Enlightenment thinkers Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and others had chipped away at the philosophical foundations of absolute monarchy. Their ideas had mostly stayed confined to the literate elite. But now, the practice of drafting cahiers exposed millions of French citizens to new political language. Even those who could not read had their thoughts translated into formal demands. Suddenly, peasants who once knew only the priest and the tax collector were asking questions like, what gives the king absolute power? Why are some citizens taxed while others are not? Could laws be made by elected representatives? This explosion of political engagement was unprecedented, and printing presses, once focused on religious texts or royal decrees, were now churning out pamphlets, journals, and speeches. One pamphlet, written anonymously by Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, became a sensation. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it want to be? Something. The political silence of the masses was broken, and it was not going to be quiet again. The Estates General convenes, May 5, 1789. When the Estates General finally convened at Versailles, it was a scene of choreographed tradition. The First Estate clergy wore flowing robes. The Second Estate nobility glittered with medals and lace. The Third Estate commoners wore black, with no frills. Their dignity was in numbers almost 600 deputies, more than double the number of the other two estates. Yet despite their size, they had no more power than any other estate. Each estate got one vote. The privileged classes could always outvote the commoners, 2-1. Hope began to sour into resentment. The fight over voting by head. From the start, the Third Estate demanded voting by head, not by order. That would give them a majority, but the king and the nobles resisted. What followed was weeks of deadlock. No laws were passed, no taxes resolved. France remained in crisis, but the chamber echoed with silence and procedural delays. Then, on June 17, 1789, the Third Estate took a radical step. Declaring themselves the National Assembly, they claimed the exclusive right to represent the people of France. It was not a revolution yet, but it was a constitutional earthquake. The tennis court oath. 3 days later, they were locked out of their meeting hall. Whether it was maintenance or a royal maneuver remains unclear. Either way, the message was unmistakable. Refusing to disperse, they moved to a nearby indoor tennis court, where 576 members of the Third Estate took a solemn vow. We swear never to separate, and to meet wherever the circumstances demand, until the Constitution of the kingdom is established. This became known as the Tennis Court Oath, one of the most iconic moments in revolutionary France. It was a declaration of political will, a refusal to yield to the king's whims, and it shocked the world. The king's dilemma. Louis XVI now faced a choice: force, compromise, or stall. He tried all three. He ordered the estates to meet together, a small concession. He then summoned troops to Versailles, a show of power. And finally, he dismissed Jacques Necker, whose popularity had only grown. But Necker's dismissal, on July 11, was a grave miscalculation. In Paris, word of his firing spread like wildfire. Rumors of a royal coup began to circulate. People feared that the king was about to crush the National Assembly by force. And with soldiers now camped around Paris, that fear was not entirely unfounded. The streets stir. The people of Paris, already famished and furious, began to mobilize. They armed themselves with sticks, makeshift weapons, and stolen muskets. Rumors flew of royalist plots, foreign mercenaries, and a massacre in the making. Barricades were raised. Shops closed. Food prices soared again. The army's presence became intolerable. Paris was on the edge not of protest, but of insurrection. And the people were looking for something or somewhere to strike. An old fortress in a new world. The Bastille, a crumbling medieval fortress in the east of Paris, symbolized royal tyranny. It had housed political prisoners, enemies of the state, and dissidents often without trial. Though it held only 7 prisoners in July 1789, its dark walls stood as a monument to secrecy and abuse. It was lightly guarded, poorly maintained, and not strategically essential, but it was symbolically immense. As word of the king's troop movements and Necker's dismissal echoed through Paris, eyes turned toward the Bastille. Ending reflection. The Estates General had begun as a last resort for a bankrupt crown, but within weeks it had become a platform for revolution. Ideas once confined to philosophers now marched into legislative halls. Commoners once barred from power now declared themselves the voice of the nation. And all across Paris, the people began to believe that if their leaders would not act, they would act themselves. But what happens when the people move faster than the revolution they've ignited? It was the summer of 1789, and the heat pressed down on Paris like the weight of 1,000 unanswered grievances. Across the city, tensions had reached a boiling point. What began as parliamentary debate had spilled into the streets. France's financial crisis, its broken institutions, and the crown's indecisive actions had bred a new kind of unrest, one that no edict or royal speech could contain. And so it was, on the morning of July 14, that ordinary Parisians decided to take history into their own hands. The days before the storm, the days leading up to the storming of the Bastille, were charged with anxiety and rumors. Necker's dismissal on July 11 had been the final insult. To many Parisians, Necker was a symbol of reform, a man who had at least acknowledged the suffering of the Third Estate. His removal suggested the king was preparing to crack down on dissent. At the same time, thousands of foreign troops, particularly German and Swiss regiments loyal to the monarchy, began encircling Paris. People whispered of a military siege, or a massacre, or the arrest of the National Assembly. Citizens began arming themselves. Gunsmiths were raided. On July 13, the Hôtel des Invalides, a military hospital and armory, was broken into. Roughly 30,000 muskets were taken, but they had no gunpowder. The Bastille had plenty. The Bastille, fortress and fear. The Bastille Saint-Anne, originally built to defend Paris against English attacks during the 100 Years' War, now served a very different purpose. By 1789, it was used primarily as a state prison, although it rarely held many prisoners. Still, it loomed large in the public imagination. The prison symbolized royal arbitrariness, a place where individuals could be detained indefinitely under the lettres de cachet, royal warrants that required no trial. Although only 7 prisoners remained inside, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and 1 nobleman, none of that mattered to the angry crowds. What mattered was the building's symbolism. The Bastille was a fossil of oppression. Spiral calendar, July 14, the storming. Early that morning, a crowd began to gather outside the Bastille. Tensions rose quickly. Governor Bernard-René de Launay, in charge of the fortress, tried to negotiate. He offered to receive a delegation and assured the crowd that he had no intention of firing on the people. But confusion and fear dominated. At some point the crowd surged, shots rang out. Some accounts say the garrison fired first. Others claim the crowd misunderstood a movement at the gate. Either way, the siege had begun. A battle of wills. The standoff lasted for hours. The Bastille's defenders, around 100 men, including invalid soldiers and Swiss mercenaries, had a strong position. But they lacked clear orders, and more importantly, they lacked will. Meanwhile, the crowd outside grew in number and determination. Cannon fire echoed across the eastern edge of Paris. Smoke and confusion thickened the air. At one point, the crowd dragged up several cannons taken from the invalids and began bombarding the gate. Eventually, some of the fortress's defenders panicked and opened the outer gates, hoping to prevent a massacre. But it was too late. The crowd flooded in. Launay, realizing resistance was futile, surrendered. He never made it to trial. The crowd seized him and killed him on the spot, stabbing and shooting before cutting off his head and parading it through the streets on a pike. The revolution had found its first icon of vengeance. The birth of the revolutionary mob. The storming of the Bastille was not a premeditated coup. It had no central leadership, no detailed plan. It was a spontaneous uprising, fed by hunger, fear, and years of accumulated resentment. What made it revolutionary was not its strategic value. It had little but its symbolic weight. The people of Paris had overthrown a royal fortress, and they had done so not by decree or vote, but by direct action. For centuries, kings ruled with the assumption that the people feared them. Now, that assumption was shattered. The National Assembly responds. News of the Bastille's fall reached Versailles the next day. Louis XVI, reportedly waking from a nap, asked his advisor, "Is this a revolt?" "No, sire," came the reply. "It is a revolution." The National Assembly moved quickly to absorb and contain the revolutionary energy. They created the National Guard, a people's militia led by Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of the American War. They adopted the tricolor cockade, blue, white, and red, as a symbol of unity between the monarchy and the people. And most importantly, they continued meeting, now with greater legitimacy than ever before. Louis XVI, facing the abyss, visited Paris on July 17. Wearing the tricolor and escorted by Lafayette, he addressed the crowd. For now, he accepted the revolution's terms. But the gesture was hollow. Trust had already broken. The Bastille's physical and political collapse. Soon after its fall, the Bastille was systematically demolished, stone by stone. Its key was sent to George Washington as a gift. Souvenirs, bricks, chains, iron bars were sold across France and Europe. This act of physical destruction mirrored the mental deconstruction of monarchy. If a royal fortress could be reduced to rubble, why not the institutions that built it? Why not privilege? Why not absolute monarchy? Why not the entire structure of the ancient regime? International reactions. Across Europe, aristocrats and monarchs watched with dread. In England, writers and thinkers split between admiration and alarm. Edmund Burke decried the revolution's chaos, while Thomas Paine praised its potential. In the American Republic, veterans like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams saw in the revolution echoes of their own war for independence, though with a worrisome edge. But in the royal courts of Vienna, Madrid, and Berlin, there was little doubt. This was the beginning of something dangerous. France had become unpredictable. The king's authority in decline. By the end of 1789, Louis XVI had lost his monopoly on power. He had not been deposed nor exiled. He still held the throne, but his authority was now shared, diluted by the growing power of the National Assembly, the Parisian mob, and the revolutionary press. In name, France remained a monarchy. In practice, it was rapidly becoming something else, a hybrid, unstable, transformative state where the old rules no longer applied. And though few realized it yet, the events of July 14 were not the climax. They were merely the opening act. Final reflection. The French Revolution did not begin with a manifesto or a plan. It began with a budget crisis, a forgotten parliament, and an old fortress torn down by desperate hands. In that collapse of stone and silence, the people of France found their voice. But revolution is a path with no map. When the people tear down the walls, what comes next? Story 2. The Estates General. How a medieval institution sparked modern change. In an age of enlightenment, printing presses, and bustling Parisian cafes, it may seem strange that one of the most pivotal events in French history began with a feudal institution last called to session in 1614. But history often turns on its forgotten hinges. The Estates General, long dormant, was never meant to ignite a revolution. It was intended as a pressure release, a way for King Louis XVI to address his kingdom's mounting financial troubles while preserving royal authority. Instead, it unleashed one of the most significant political transformations in European history. What was the Estates General? The Estates General, Etats Généraux, was a representative assembly made up of 3 distinct estates, or social orders. First estate, the clergy. Second estate, the nobility. Third estate, everyone else, about 97% of the population. In theory, this structure was designed to offer a balanced cross-section of French society. In reality, it preserved the privileges of the few at the expense of the many. Each estate met separately and cast one collective vote. This meant that, regardless of the population they represented, the first and second estates could easily outvote the third, blocking any reform that threatened their privileges. Why now? By the late 1780s, France was bankrupt. The causes were layered. The immense costs of the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, the extravagant spending of the court, and an ineffective, unjust taxation system that fell disproportionately on the Third Estate. Repeated attempts to reform taxation had failed. Ministers came and went: Turgot, Calonne, Brienne, each offering plans to reduce the deficit, each encountering the same resistance. Eventually, with no political capital left, Louis XVI agreed to convene the Estates General. But this wasn't a concession to democracy. It was a gamble, a chance to impose reforms with a stamp of legitimacy, without truly changing the structure of power. Calling the nation to speak. The King's Edict, issued in 1788, summoned the Estates General for May 1789. The process to prepare the session began months earlier, and it unleashed an unprecedented wave of political engagement. Across France, people gathered in their parishes, towns, and cities to elect deputies and compile cahiers de doléances, the infamous notebooks of grievances. These documents captured the voices of the kingdom. A peasant complaining about landlord abuses. A merchant demanding free trade across provincial lines. A young clergyman lamenting the church's corruption. An artisan protesting rising food prices and unfair taxes. The mere act of compiling grievances had a powerful effect. Millions of people were suddenly asked what they wanted from their country. And they answered with paper, passion, and hope. Composition of the estates. Roughly 1,200 deputies were elected to the Estates General. 291 from the First Estate clergy. 270 from the Second Estate nobility. 578 from the Third Estate commoners. This doubling of the Third Estate's numbers was seen as a reform, but because voting was still to be done by estate, not by head, it changed little in practice. Nonetheless, the delegation of the Third Estate included a mix of lawyers, doctors, merchants, and a few landowners, many of them well-educated and influenced by Enlightenment thinking. They were not peasants in rags. They were intelligent, articulate, and increasingly frustrated by their exclusion from meaningful power. A new type of politician. Among the delegates of the Third Estate were figures who would soon become central to the revolution. Maximilien Robespierre, a quiet, incorruptible lawyer from Arras. Georges Danton, a loud, forceful orator with radical sympathies. Jean-Sylvain Bailly, an astronomer and scholar. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, a clergyman and author of What is the Third Estate. Sieyès' pamphlet had electrified the nation. He wrote, "It is not the privileged orders who form the nation. It is the great body of citizens. It is the third estate." His ideas were not merely rhetorical, they were foundational. He proposed that sovereignty resided in the people, not in the king. Versailles, a stage for conflict. When the deputies gathered at Versailles in May 1789, the setting was full of irony. Here, in the golden halls of royal absolutism, the most radical questioning of monarchical legitimacy in centuries was about to take place. Each estate met separately in different chambers. The king and his ministers controlled the schedule. It was a ceremonial affair, designed more to display royal benevolence than to create meaningful reform. But the mood had shifted. Expectations were high, especially among the Third Estate. What they wanted was simple: voting by head, not by estate. Recognition as the true representation of the nation. Real structural change, not just speeches. But the monarchy refused to yield. Delay and deadlock. For weeks, the estates bickered about procedural issues. The Third Estate demanded verification of credentials in common. The First and Second Estates, unsure of what that meant for their privileges, resisted. No reforms were passed, no decrees were issued. The kingdom still faced bankruptcy, famine, and unrest. And yet no action was taken. This bureaucratic limbo became intolerable. The Third Estate breaks away. On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. It claimed to represent the entire nation, and it invited the other two estates to join. Some clergy defected and joined them, a few liberal nobles too. But the king, alarmed by their boldness, closed their meeting hall on June 20 officially for repairs, but clearly as a form of obstruction. Undeterred, the assembly moved to a nearby indoor tennis court, where they made their now famous tennis court oath, to remain united until they had created a new constitution for France. It was the first open act of defiance against the king's authority, and it marked the beginning of popular sovereignty. Reflection and tension. The Estates General had been revived as a tool of monarchy, but by mid-1789, it had transformed into a laboratory of revolution. People across France, peasants in fields, urban workers in cafes, even soldiers in barracks began to ask new questions. What does it mean to be a citizen? Who holds power in a nation? Can tradition be rewritten? It was no longer about taxes or budgets. It was about identity, justice, and legitimacy. And as June turned to July, and rumors of troops near Paris grew louder, the revolution that began in a conference hall prepared to move into the streets. When the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, it didn't merely rename a political body, it redefined authority in France. For centuries, power had been top-down, sanctified by divine right, flowing from king to people. Now, the current was revering. The people claimed the right to govern themselves, and with each passing week in the summer of 1789, that idea grew more powerful and more dangerous. But ideas alone cannot transform a society. What followed was a slow, deliberate process of institutional transformation, bitter internal divisions, and growing tension with a king still uncertain whether to accept or suppress the tide. The tennis court oath echoes across France. The image of 576 delegates crowded into a stuffy tennis court, raising their right arms in solemn unity, spread rapidly. Though there were no photographs or live broadcasts, the symbolism was unmistakable. Artists sketched it, pamphlets described it. The oath became legend in days. Their vow was simple: we will not separate until we have given France a constitution. This was a bold and illegal act, a direct challenge to the king's authority, but it resonated far beyond Versailles. In towns and cities, people began organizing their own municipal committees. Soldiers in some regiments began to question their commanders. Even in rural villages, whispers of change stirred the air. The Estates General had been summoned to address a fiscal crisis, but it had instead become a crucible of political awakening. Louis XVI's response, confused and constrained. King Louis XVI was, by nature and training, ill-prepared for revolution. He was pious, indecisive, and rooted in tradition. Though not cruel, he was detached from the realities beyond Versailles. The complexities of Enlightenment philosophy and popular sovereignty were foreign to him. At first, he tried a middle course. On June 23, he held a séance royale, asserting that the three estates must meet separately. But the deputies of the Third Estate refused to leave their chamber. They stood silently, a mass of defiance. Famously, Count Murraybow, one of the more eloquent figures of the assembly, replied to the king's envoy, "Go tell your master that we are here by the will of the people, and we shall not leave except by force of bayonets." The king blinked. He allowed all the estates to meet together. For the first time, royal authority had publicly yielded to popular pressure. The National Assembly begins its work. With their position secured, the National Assembly turned from protest to governance. They began drafting articles for a new constitution, focusing on the separation of powers, legal equality, protection of property, civil liberties, a new judicial system, fiscal reform, and equitable taxation. These were not just Enlightenment theories, they were responses to centuries of abuse and inequality. The Assembly's early decisions included abolishing feudal privileges, opening civil offices to all men, not just nobles, and ending the sale of public offices. And then, in August 1789, they issued one of the most important documents in French history, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This declaration, passed on August 26, became the moral and philosophical foundation of the revolution. Its key principles included: men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. Law is the expression of the general will. The document was influenced by Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and even the American Declaration of Independence. But unlike earlier documents, this one directly confronted the monarchy. It rejected the divine right of kings, endorsed popular sovereignty, and asserted that the people were the nation. It was an elegant text, full of soaring language. But it raised difficult questions. Did it apply to women? No, not officially. To slaves in French colonies? Also no. To those without property or education? For now, these questions were deferred. The revolutionaries were focused on constructing a new political system, but the foundation they laid would eventually inspire movements across the globe. The people pushed forward. While the assembly debated, the situation in Paris worsened. Bread prices remained high, grain was scarce, unemployment soared. Meanwhile, the presence of foreign troops near Paris continued to provoke fear. Many believed the king might still attempt to dissolve the assembly by force. Tension simmered in the streets, and then on July 14, it boiled over. The storming of the Bastille, though sparked by the search for gunpowder, was really a response to years of suffering and days of fear. The assembly did not lead the attack, but it quickly moved to absorb the energy of the revolution. They legitimized the formation of the National Guard, led by the popular Marquis de Lafayette. They introduced new symbols like the tricolor cockade to unify the movement. The assembly now walked a narrow line, trying to calm the crowds without betraying their cause. Power shifts to the cities. In the aftermath of July 14, a new force entered French politics, the Paris Commune. A municipal government, largely made up of middle-class citizens and artisans, began to take over local administration. Their loyalties were with the revolution, not the crown. Other towns and cities followed suit. In Bordeaux, Lyon, and Marseille, local revolutionary committees took control. In the countryside, peasants attacked manorial records, burned tax documents, and destroyed signs of feudal authority. This wave of violence and revolt, known as the Great Fear, La Grande Peur, swept across France in July and August. It was not centrally organized. It had no manifesto, but it sent a clear message. The old regime was crumbling from below as well as above. The August 4 decrees, a night of abolition. On the night of August 4, 1789, in the wake of the Great Fear, the National Assembly met in a marathon session. What happened was unexpected even to those present. One by one, nobles stood up to renounce their feudal privileges. Hunting rights, judicial monopolies, exemptions from taxes, seigneurial dues, tithes to the church. Some did so sincerely, others perhaps bowed to the pressure of events. Regardless, by sunrise, the feudal system in France was officially abolished. It was a historic moment, though the implementation would be slower and less complete than the headlines suggested. Still, on paper, the revolution had struck at the very heart of the ancient regime. Closing reflection. The Estates General had been called to rescue a monarchy from debt. Within months, it had been repurposed into the instrument of national rebirth. Old institutions fell like dominoes: parliaments, noble courts, seigneurial rights, clerical immunity. But as the assembly moved closer to establishing a constitutional monarchy, it remained unclear whether the king and the people could live with compromise. Because the revolution, now fully underway, had a momentum of its own. And revolutions, once begun, rarely end where they are intended to. By the close of 1789, the Estates General, once a dormant symbol of medieval governance, had evolved into the National Assembly, a body that claimed to speak on behalf of the entire nation. The France that had summoned the Estates General was not the France that now looked to the Assembly for answers. Something irreversible had occurred. Monarchy still existed, but its meaning had changed. Power was no longer a birthright, it was becoming an argument, a negotiation, and increasingly a shared commodity. But the structure was fragile. As the Assembly moved to codify change into a constitutional framework, it encountered new dilemmas: how to balance reform with order, liberty with stability, and how to govern a society already running ahead of its institutions. Designing the new France, a constitutional experiment. The Assembly's first and most pressing task was to craft a constitution. But this was not a theoretical debate. Every article had implications for landowners, priests, urban workers, and the crown itself. They debated for months. Key early decisions included a unicameral legislature rather than two chambers, a suspensive veto for the king; he could delay, but not block legislation, the abolition of noble titles and hereditary privileges, clear guarantees of freedom of speech, religion, and the press. This framework was aimed at limiting monarchy, not abolishing it. The idea was to preserve the king as a constitutional figurehead, while sovereignty passed to the nation. Yet for every reform passed, reality presented new challenges. The church becomes a battleground. One of the most divisive reforms was the civil constitution of the clergy, passed in July 1790. Its terms: clergy would be paid by the state. Bishops and priests would be elected by citizens, including non-Catholics. All clergy were required to swear loyalty to the Constitution. It was a radical break from tradition. In effect, it nationalized the church. While some clergy so-called jurors took the oath, many others refused, non-jurors or refractory priests. These dissenters, especially in rural areas, would become focal points for counter-revolutionary sentiment in the years ahead. The Pope condemned the law. Pious peasants grew uneasy. For many who had once cheered reform, the attack on the church felt like a step too far. Religion, long a pillar of unity, was now a line of division. The king walks among the people. On October 5, 1789, in the aftermath of bread riots and rising unrest, thousands of women from Paris marched to Versailles. Their original demand was simple: bread. But their presence transformed into something larger. Joined by National Guardsmen, they surrounded the palace, confronted the king, and ultimately escorted the royal family back to Paris, a journey known as the October Days. Louis XVI was now a king under the watch of the people. He took up residence at the Tuileries Palace, and the National Assembly followed him to Paris. Symbolically, it was a massive shift. Versailles, once the center of power, had been abandoned. Power was now in the capital and in motion. New institutions take shape. As the months passed, the Assembly restructured the entire country. France's 34 provinces were dissolved and replaced by 83 departments, with new borders designed for equal representation. Feudal courts were eliminated. In their place, new systems of elected judges were introduced. Guilds, internal tariffs, and noble monopolies were abolished. New standards for weights and measures were introduced, early steps toward the metric system. This wasn't just a political revolution, it was an administrative one. Every facet of public life was now being reshaped by paperwork, legislation, and local committees. But it created new problems too. Not everyone understood the new systems. Enforcement varied wildly. Local elites sometimes filled power vacuums. Confusion and occasionally chaos followed. Still, the idea was clear. France was being rebuilt from the ground up. A new social order, or just a new elite. One unintended consequence of these reforms was the rise of a new ruling class. The abolition of noble privileges opened opportunities for bourgeois professionals, many of whom now held positions in the National Guard, the Assembly, and local governments. Property requirements for voting meant that many poor citizens were still excluded from meaningful political participation. France was no longer ruled by birthright, but it was not yet a true democracy either. It was a bourgeois republic in waiting, still sorting through the limits of liberty and equality. Some revolutionaries, like Robespierre, warned of this. He argued passionately for universal male suffrage and protections for the poor, but his voice was still a minority. For now, the revolution remained legalistic, moderate, and property-based. Suspicion grows in the background. Despite the progress, many began to grow uneasy. Royalists saw the king as a prisoner. Peasants were angered by the church reforms. Radicals feared the revolution was stalling. Foreign monarchies watched with alarm. Most troubling of all, Louis XVI himself remained ambivalent. Though he swore loyalty to the Constitution, he secretly corresponded with foreign powers and plotted his escape. The king had accepted change, but not truly embraced it. And then, in June 1791, he made his move. The flight to Varennes. Disguised and traveling in a heavy coach, the royal family fled Paris under cover of night, hoping to reach loyalist territory in eastern France. But they were recognized in the town of Varennes, detained, and escorted back to Paris under guard. The impact was shattering. Louis XVI had not just abandoned his people, he had betrayed the very constitution he swore to uphold. The people of Paris watched in stony silence as the royal carriage rolled past. For many, the idea of a constitutional monarchy no longer seemed tenable. Trust once lost is hard to recover. In the weeks following the flight, the National Assembly tried to contain the crisis. They claimed the king had been abducted rather than defected. They moved forward with the Constitution, but public trust was irreparably damaged. In July 1791, protesters gathered at the Champ de Mars to demand the king's abdication. The Assembly, now fearful of mob rule, authorized the National Guard to intervene. The result was a massacre, dozens of civilians killed. Revolutionaries now turned on each other. Was order more important than justice? Was liberty possible without bloodshed? The Estates General, once a symbol of hope, had now become a battlefield of competing visions. Final reflection. The Estates General began as a technical solution to a budget crisis, a last-ditch attempt to preserve the old order. But in awakening the political consciousness of the nation, it became a revolutionary institution. In a matter of months, it redefined sovereignty, rewrote laws, and began reshaping French life in every direction. Yet revolutions rarely proceed in straight lines. The same assembly that promised unity would soon give way to new divisions: radicals, moderates, royalists, Jacobins, Girondins. The people's patience would wear thin. Blood would follow. Still, for a brief, shining moment, the Estates General stood at the threshold between a crumbling world and an unknown future. And it dared to ask, can a nation rebuild itself from the ruins of its own traditions? Story 3, Bread and Blood, The Women's March on Versailles. Paris, October 1789. You can smell the tension before you hear it. It drifts through the alleys and stalls of the market: stale bread, sour wine, and sweat from a crowd with nothing left to lose. 4 months have passed since the fall of the Bastille. The National Assembly debates lofty principles in the converted Royal Riding School, and the king, now a constitutional monarch, sits uncomfortably at the Tuileries in Paris. But none of that matters much in Les Halles, the city's central marketplace, because there is still no bread. And the people, especially the women, are done waiting. Bread, the real crisis: hunger. Revolutionary slogans like liberté and égalité make good posters, but empty stomachs do not care for ideology. Bread was the staple of the French diet. For most working-class Parisians, it made up as much as 80% of their daily caloric intake. In the fall of 1789, food prices remained dangerously high. Harvests had been poor the previous year. Grain hoarding, real or suspected, added to the shortages, and the new National Assembly had no effective means of managing the supply chains. The result was disaster in the making. A 2-pound loaf that once cost 4 sous now cost 14 or more. For families living on the edge, this was the difference between eating and starvation. Woman, the marketplace as parliament. In the markets of Paris, women were the politicians. They gathered early each morning, lining up before dawn. They haggled, they argued, they shared news and gossip. For many, the market was not just a place to buy food, it was a social hub, a rumor mill, and increasingly a cauldron of discontent. When news traveled often via fishwives, who moved between the docks and the city with baskets and barbed tongues, it was filtered through this network. And in October, one rumor spread like fire through these winding alleys. The king and queen were hoarding grain at Versailles. Classical building, the banquet that lit a fuse. The anger spiked following an event that, while small, became symbolically explosive. On October 1, 1789, the royal bodyguard hosted a lavish banquet at Versailles to welcome new troops. The setting was theatrical: crystal glasses, roast meats, court music, and an abundance of wine. But what truly angered Parisians were reports, exaggerated or not, that officers had trampled on the tricolor cockade, symbol of the revolution, toasted the king and queen with anti-revolutionary chants, openly mocked the National Assembly. To a hungry city, this was not mere bad taste, it was treasonous theater. Roll of paper, a march begins. On October 5, a spontaneous gathering of mostly working-class women led by market vendors, laundresses, cooks, seamstresses, and housewives assembled at the Hotel de Ville. They were angry but not yet an organized army. They demanded bread, grain controls, and answers from the king. Initially, their plan was unclear. Some demanded the city provide food, others wanted to petition the National Assembly. But as speeches were made and frustrations mounted, the purpose sharpened. They would march to Versailles, nearly 12 miles away. By midday, the crowd had swelled to thousands. Wrenched from protest to procession. This was no mob, not yet. The women marched in ranks, many armed with kitchen knives, pikes, broomsticks, or whatever they could find. Some pulled cannons taken from the Hotel de Ville. Their chants echoed through the streets. Bread, bread. We want the baker's wife, and the baker's boy. Meaning, bring the king and his family to Paris. As they marched, they were joined by men, including members of the National Guard. At first, Guard commanders tried to hold them back. But soon, Lafayette, the reluctant revolutionary hero, was convinced to follow with his troops, if only to maintain order. By nightfall, an army of over 20,000 people approached Versailles. Versailles, an illusion of safety. The royal court had long treated Versailles as a sanctuary from unrest. Surrounded by gardens, fountains, and ceremonial guards, it had remained untouched during the storming of the Bastille. The palace had grown quiet in recent weeks, its halls echoing with the uncertain tread of a monarch who no longer ruled absolutely. On October 5, as news of the march reached Versailles, panic set in. The court was unprepared. Marie Antoinette's advisors urged her to flee. She refused. King Louis XVI, indecisive as ever, offered to distribute grain, then delayed. He agreed to meet a delegation from the protesters but did nothing more. The crowd outside was wet, exhausted, and hungry, but they waited. Because now it was not just about bread. Cloud with rain threw rain and rage. That night the women camped in the palace square, huddling beneath wagons and sheets. Rain poured, tempers simmered. Inside, the assembly debated, and the king delayed. Some believed the presence of the National Guard would prevent violence. Others suspected that no guard could hold back desperation. Tensions finally broke just before dawn. Candle-ending reflection. What happens when ordinary people, long dismissed as voiceless, decide to take the road to power into their own hands? They were not soldiers. They were not nobles or clergy. They were not even National Assembly deputies. They were mothers, wives, laborers, and breadwinners, and now they stood at the gates of Versailles, demanding answers. The question remained: would the palace open its gates, or would France's fate be decided by force? October 6, 1789, just before dawn. The palace gates at Versailles creaked in the darkness, slick with the night's rain. Lanterns sputtered. Fog clung to the gardens like a warning. Inside, the court slept or tried to. Outside, the mob of thousands was growing restless. What began as a march for bread was about to become a turning point in the French Revolution I, where mothers, fishwives, and working women forced the king to see a reality no royal parade could mask. And when the sun rose, the monarchy would never again rule untouched from behind its gilded gates. Classical building, the calm before the chaos. The National Assembly, which had arrived at Versailles ahead of the crowd, was caught between fear and obligation. Deputies debated into the night, unsure whether to support the marchers or the monarchy. King Louis XVI, meanwhile, had done little. He'd received a delegation from the women and promised to distribute food, even approving the August decrees which abolished feudal privileges. But the women were not satisfied. What they wanted was action, assurance, and proximity. They believed the king should live among the people, not behind guards and marble gates. 5 o'clock, a sudden breach. At around 5:30 a.m. it happened. A group of protesters, mostly women, along with a few men, found an unguarded entrance to the palace grounds. Accounts vary as to whether it was a gate or a basement door, but what followed is well documented. They surged inside. The garde du corps, the royal bodyguards, were caught by surprise. A fight broke out in the corridors. One guard was killed, his head later paraded on a pike. Another tried to bar a hallway leading to Marie Antoinette's apartments. He bought her just enough time to flee, barefoot, across the palace to the king's chambers. Versailles was no longer a symbol of royal majesty. It was a palace under siege. Crown: the royal family faces the people. The royal family, awakened and shaken, now faced a decision of enormous consequence. Outside, the square was filled with thousands, mostly women, soaked from the night, still clutching weapons. They demanded one thing: the king must come to Paris. By now, Lafayette had arrived with the National Guard. Though technically loyal to the crown, his real allegiance was to stability, and he knew that resisting the people would result in bloodshed. He entered the royal chambers. He made his case. The king relented. But that was not enough. The crowd chanted, "The queen must come to the balcony." It was a dangerous request. The queen had become the revolution's primary villain, blamed for extravagance, foreign influence, and callous disregard for the poor. Nonetheless, Marie Antoinette stepped out. She stood on the balcony with her 2 children. The crowd shouted for her to send them away. She did, and then she stood alone. There was silence, then some cheers, then shouts, but no violence. This strange moment of human contact marked a temporary pause in the fury. The return to Paris. By mid-morning, the decision was final. The king, queen, and their children would return to Paris, escorted by the marchers and the National Guard. It was not a triumphant procession. It was a funeral for royal majesty. The crowd pulled wagons loaded with flour and grain seized from the palace stores. Some carried weapons, others chanted. All eyes were on the royal carriage. One chronicler described it: "The baker, the baker's wife, and the little baker's boy are coming to Paris." That phrase said it all. The king was now a provider, not a ruler, a servant of the people, not a sovereign above them. Versailles abandoned. The royal court never returned to Versailles. The palace, once the center of European power and culture, became a ghost of its former self, its halls quiet, its fountains stilled. It would later become a museum, but in October 1789, it became a ruin of symbolism, the fallen throne of divine monarchy. Meanwhile, in Paris, the Tuileries Palace became the new royal residence, but the king no longer governed. He was watched. He was contained. He had become a constitutional decoration, not a monarch. Repeat button, immediate consequences. The Women's March on Versailles had no official leadership, no military strategy, and no formal agenda beyond food and proximity. Yet it achieved more in one night than months of legislative argument. It forced the king to recognize the authority of the people. It demonstrated that women were active political agents, not passive spectators. It ended the physical separation between court and capital. And it signaled that power now resided in Paris. Most of all, it proved that mass action, even spontaneous and emotional, could change the course of history. Adult chief: the role of women in the revolution. Historians often describe revolutions as battles between kings and ideologues, armies and politicians. But in France, it was women, those who cooked, cleaned, sewed, and stood in bread lines, who lit some of the earliest sparks. The marchers weren't philosophers or generals. They were driven by hunger, yes, but also by agency, intuition, and a fierce belief that their voices mattered. And when they moved, France followed. Candle closing reflection. Versailles had once been the stage of absolutism, a place where the sun rose and set on the king's command. But in October 1789, that sun set forever. It wasn't toppled by armies. It wasn't dismantled by foreign invasion. It was overturned by shoeless women with pikes, demanding bread and justice. And as the royal carriage creaked toward Paris, escorted by the very people it had tried to forget, a question lingered in the air. What happens to kings who must now follow their people? By the morning of October 7, 1789, the royal family had taken up residence at the Tuileries Palace in Paris. It was not a triumphant return. King Louis XVI was no longer revered. He was surrounded, watched, and expected to obey. His family lived under the vague pretense of royal life, but it was nothing more than a cage with velvet curtains. The Women's March on Versailles had brought the monarchy to heel, but it also marked a new phase of the French Revolution, one where the people demanded more than symbolism. And though the crowd had dispersed, their impact would linger, shaping events in ways no musket volley ever could. Classical building Paris, the new seat of power. Once nestled safely behind the gilded walls of Versailles, Louis XVI now found himself governing from a city in constant unrest. From his windows at the Tuileries, he could hear the street preachers, pamphleteers, and protesters. His guards were National Guardsmen loyal to Lafayette, a moderate revolutionary who sought to preserve a constitutional monarchy, but who no longer fully trusted the king. Across town, the National Assembly resumed its work, now within reach of the people it claimed to represent. No longer separated by miles of royal forest, the Assembly's deputies could see, hear, and feel the daily pressure of the public. Paris had become the crucible of revolution. Thought ballooned the king's inner conflict. Louis XVI struggled with his new reality. He signed decrees, approved reforms, and issued statements, but he did so grudgingly, doubtfully, and often privately resentful. He had never believed that a monarch could share power with the people, not without chaos, and he feared, with growing clarity, that each concession only brought more demands. His court shrank. Many nobles fled the country, becoming émigrés. The aristocratic salons emptied. Versailles, abandoned, became a symbol of lost grandeur. The king, once the center of all political and spiritual life, now found himself reduced to an emblem, a wax figure in a republic in the making. Crown Marie Antoinette, from queen to prisoner. For Marie Antoinette, the transition was even starker. Once the hostess of Europe's most glittering court, she was now vilified in the press, mocked in street songs, and blamed for every hunger and injustice. Caricatures showed her guzzling champagne while peasants starved. Rumors swirled about affairs, extravagant debts, and treasonous correspondence with Austria. She seldom appeared in public. When she did, she moved with caution and silence, guarded by men who did not love her. In private, she remained defiant, urging the king to resist and to preserve the dignity of their station. But Versailles was gone. The powdered wigs, the court ballets, the elaborate etiquette, it was all ashes. And what remained was fear, uncertainty, and the cold nearness of the people. Adult, the legacy of the marchers. The women who marched on Versailles did not return to political obscurity. Many of them joined local assemblies, formed vigilance committees, or returned to the Paris marketplaces with renewed political awareness. Some, like the washerwoman Louise Réigny-Otto, would continue participating in revolutionary events, including future insurrections. The October days made clear that political agency was not limited by gender or class. When the government failed to deliver bread, it was not elite revolutionaries who acted. It was mothers, widows, and working women. And the revolution would never again ignore them. Detective growing suspicion, deepening crisis. In the months that followed, revolutionary energy continued to build. The National Assembly drafted the Constitution of 1791, formally limiting the king's powers. Church lands were nationalized, and priests required to swear loyalty to the nation. Nobles continued to emigrate, prompting fears of foreign intervention. Street protests turned more radical, more violent. And beneath it all, a deep question remained. Was the king truly committed to the new France? His outward compliance did little to calm revolutionary fears. His secret correspondence with Austria, his hesitation, and his court's remaining loyalists hinted that his heart remained in Versailles or in Vienna. Classical building, the people's demands hardened. After Versailles, protesters came to understand something profound. They had the power to shape the revolution directly. No longer satisfied with passive reforms or symbolic gestures, the Parisian crowds began to call for more food, more equality, and eventually, a republic. Lafayette and other moderates tried to hold the center, but each time the king hesitated, and each time the economic crisis deepened, the revolution inched toward radicalism. The return from Versailles had changed the public's relationship with monarchy. The king was no longer a sacred figure, but a civil servant. And when civil servants fail, the people do not kneel, they act. Candle final reflection. The Women's March on Versailles is often remembered as a moment of spectacle, women with pikes and pitchforks, storming a palace and dragging a king back to the capital. But that memory misses its deeper meaning. It was not just a march for bread. It was the moment when the veil of royal mystery was lifted, when the people saw the crown up close and found it human, fragile, and fallible. It was the day the king became a citizen. But once a king has become a citizen, can he ever be king again? Story 4. Life in Paris before the storm, daily routines and quiet desperation. Before the storming of the Bastille, before the chants of liberty echoed in the streets, and before the monarchy teetered on the edge of collapse, there was daily life. Ordinary, repetitive, often miserable. It is easy to forget that revolutions are born in ordinary days, not just in speeches and battles, but in markets, bakeries, workshops, and crowded alleyways where life plays out with measured repetition and growing frustration. Paris, on the eve of revolution, was not aflame. It was anxious, hungry, and slowly awakening to a new political language it did not fully understand. But before Paris shouted, it whispered. Let us walk through the city not as tourists or time travelers, but as inhabitants, waking to the rhythm of a city about to change forever. Mantelpiece clock, the morning bell, and the Parisian routine. The day in pre-revolutionary Paris began early, often before sunrise, especially for laborers and tradesmen. The clang of the church bell, the growl of iron carts on cobblestones, and the murmur of street vendors marked the start of another day. Bakers were already at their ovens. Market women gathered their goods. Servants fetched water from public fountains. Men and boys left for apprenticeships or day labor. Clergy and officials emerged from doors in the wealthier quarters, heading toward churches and government offices. There was no silence in Paris, only layers of sound. Voices, hooves, church bells, hammers, birds, and distant argument. Derelict house, the neighborhoods, rich and poor side by side. Paris was a city of extremes. In the grand districts near the Place Vendôme and Faubourg Saint-Honoré, noble families lived in lavish hotels, particuliers, town mansions with gardens, libraries, and high walls. But just a short walk away, the working-class neighborhoods of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine and Saint-Marcel were cramped and noisy. In these districts, rooms were small, often with entire families living in one bed. Sanitation was minimal, waste was thrown into the street. Food was scarce, especially during harsh winters. Children worked as early as age 7 or 8, apprenticed to cobblers, coopers, or cartwrights. Diseases like smallpox, typhus, and tuberculosis moved silently through the alleys. There was no police force in the modern sense. Authority came in burst soldiers, tax collectors, clerks, or priests. But disorder was common, and most learned to navigate it with weary skill. Bred the struggle for bread. In the years leading to 1789, the price of bread was the single greatest concern for most Parisians. Bread was not a side dish. It was the primary source of sustenance for the majority. The daily wage of a laborer was often just enough to buy 2 loaves, and in times of scarcity, that price doubled or tripled. Riots over bread were not unusual. Women, often responsible for feeding families, were the first to gather at bakeries and the first to protest when supply failed. It wasn't just hunger. It was fear of winter, of hunger riots, of price manipulation by merchants or noble landowners. When revolution finally arrived, it was the bakeries that were broken into first. Thread work and occupation. For the working class of Paris, labor was often manual, grueling, and uncertain. Men found work as porters carrying goods across town, craftsmen trained in trades like carpentry, leatherwork, or printing, cart drivers moving materials in and out of the city, day laborers hired informally by the hour. Women worked as laundresses, washing clothes in public basins or the Seine, seamstresses sewing in cramped workshops, market sellers peddling produce, meat, or second-hand goods, domestic servants working long hours in upper-class homes. Work was seasonal, poorly paid, and often exploitative. Guilds still existed but were in decline, leaving many workers without protection or leverage. Strikes were rare and dangerous. Dissent could lead to arrest, blacklisting, or beatings. So many endured in silence, trapped in routines as rigid as any monarchy. Candle faith and ritual. Despite Enlightenment winds blowing through Parisian salons, most Parisians in the 1780s were still deeply religious. Churches were centers of community life, offering charity, education, and ritual. Sundays were reserved for Mass, and holy days were honored with feasts and processions. Baptisms, weddings, and funerals followed traditional rites, and the church still controlled moral authority in many districts. But change was stirring. Anti-clerical pamphlets had begun to circulate. Priests were accused of greed and hypocrisy. Young thinkers, especially among the bourgeoisie, read Voltaire and Diderot in secret. For now, faith remained strong, but reverence was weakening. Open book reading, rumors, and radical ideas. Literacy was rising, especially among artisans and shopkeepers. The streets of Paris had begun to pulse with a new kind of knowledge. Pamphlets were cheap and widely read, some political, some slanderous, some both. Coffee houses and salons served as spaces for debate, argument, and gossip. Newspapers like Le Révolutions de Paris stoked discontent with detailed stories of royal excess and noble corruption. And even for those who couldn't read, word of mouth filled the gap. The revolution was forming not just in books, but in conversation in markets, taverns, workshops, and church steps. People were talking about taxes, about bread, about liberty. They weren't always sure what it meant, but it felt powerful. Broomed the silent desperation of the invisible. Not every Parisian was politically aware or ideologically driven. Many lived lives of quiet survival. Orphans, the elderly, disabled veterans, and beggars moved unseen through the streets. They slept beneath stairwells. They warmed themselves in church vestibules. They lived from day to day, watching others march or riot while they remained behind. And yet, even among them, something was changing. A shift in the tone of speech, in the expectations of the poor, in the questions people dared to ask aloud. Candle closing reflection. Before the storming of the Bastille, there were no barricades. There were no guillotines or revolutionary slogans. There was only routine, repetition, and growing restlessness. The Paris of early 1789 was not a city of revolutionaries. It was a city of bread lines, backbreaking labor, and small acts of endurance. And yet, from those routines emerged a new consciousness not born of ideology, but of frustration, need, and shared injustice. Because when enough people begin to whisper the same question, why is this life all we are given? It does not take long before someone shouts it. As spring turned to summer in 1789, the mood in Paris teetered between wearied acceptance and incipient revolt. The city still moved to its familiar rhythms. Markets opened at dawn, carts jostled through narrow streets, bells rang for mass, but beneath the ordinary, a quiet fury gathered. Daily life hadn't improved, wages remained stagnant, bread was still scarce, prices remained volatile, and the once silent poor were beginning to realize something new. They were many, and those who ruled over them were few. This section explores the interior life of the city, its unnoticed actors, its tensions, its fragile social contracts before the storm broke over the Bastille. Adult factory, the artisans, and the apprentice. In the craftsman's shop, life followed a pattern that hadn't changed in generations. A master artisan, often in his 40s or 50s, would employ 1 or 2 journeymen and a young apprentice, usually between 12 and 15 years old. These boys lived with their masters, worked long hours shaping wood, forging iron, binding books, or cutting leather. They were rarely paid beyond food and shelter, but they hoped one day to join a guild, though even that path was narrowing. The guilds, once powerful, were now losing relevance, squeezed by industrial change and political pressure. For many apprentices, the future no longer promised advancement, only perpetual dependence. And though they worked with their hands, these young men were increasingly shaped by new ideas. They overheard customers talking about the Estates General, about Necker, about pamphlets and slogans they didn't fully understand but felt to be important. Their tools shaped wood and iron. Their curiosity shaped the future. Women's labor, the engine of survival. In many ways, it was women who held Paris together. Not as queens or nobles, but as laundresses, slapping garments against cold stone in the Seine. Maids, rising before dawn to scrub floors and carry firewood. Mothers, managing households on coins and prayer. Vendors, crying out in the street with baskets of onion, cheese, or ribbons. Sex workers, walking the nighttime alleys with little protection and no recourse. Few held titles, few signed documents, yet these women were the primary economic agents in tens of thousands of households. They budgeted, bargained, bartered. They managed scarcity with creativity and grit. And when the revolution began, they did not stand aside. They marched, demanded, and organized. Their political awakening did not begin in the assembly. It began in the kitchens, markets, and laundry basins of pre-revolutionary Paris. The furniture tax and everyday injustice. Among the hundreds of petty injustices that colored Parisian life, few were as despised as the tax on furniture. Under the ancient regime, tax collectors were authorized to enter homes and assess the value of one's furniture, a proxy for wealth. Tables, chairs, bedding, and even kitchen utensils could be taxed. It was humiliating. It was arbitrary. And it was felt most deeply by those already poor. This type of taxation reminded the people that they were watched, but not represented. It fed a growing awareness that the state existed to extract, not protect. Even before formal revolutionary demands took shape, the resentment against tax collectors, noble exemptions, and arbitrary fines had primed the population for resistance. Male the mute poor and the growing crowd. There were those who could not read or write, those who didn't debate Enlightenment philosophy or recite Rousseau, but they saw. They saw the overflowing waste outside noble houses, the bakeries with hidden backrooms and backdoors, the empty stomachs of their children, the priests who scolded but lived in comfort, the soldiers who moved past them without notice, the magistrates who never looked them in the eye. These mute observers, beggars, porters, disabled veterans, and the aged were not without politics. Their very presence challenged the illusion of stability. They were reminders that the city did not work for everyone, that while Paris glittered in parts, it rotted in others. Their silence was not consent, it was a pause before reckoning. Hoarse the streets and the smells. To live in Paris in 1789 was to live among smell and noise. The city had no sewer system. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets. Slaughterhouses stood near residential quarters. Horses fouled every alley. Tanners and dyers worked near the Seine, darkening the water with chemicals. Fountains were few. Drinking water was a problem. Disease was a constant threat. Yet the city was not dead. It hummed with life, color, rhythm. Street musicians played. Children chased dogs through alleys. Vendors shouted over each other. Lovers whispered in the back corners of chapels. Paris before the revolution was not a silent city. It was a loud, pungent, anxious place, alive with possibility and decay. Performing arts, the theater of politics, begins. Even before the Bastille, politics moved into the streets. Posters and handbills appeared overnight on walls and shutters. Satirical plays mocked the clergy and nobility. Small gatherings outside printing shops discussed who should represent the Third Estate. At the Palais Royal, Camille Desmoulins would soon stand on a table and call for revolt, but even before that, rumors ruled the city. Politics became public, no longer confined to salons or palaces. People who had never spoken a political word now argued about voting, grain hoarding, the Estates General, and what it meant to be free. It was not polished, it was not coherent, but it was authentic. And it was becoming dangerous. Candle closing reflection. Paris in early 1789 was not yet revolutionary. It was not yet governed by committees, patrolled by sans-culottes, or splashed with blood from guillotines. But it was pregnant with change. The people who lived in crowded tenements, who argued in the market, who were taxed for their furniture and scolded by their priests, they were beginning to look at their lives not as fate, but as something that could be changed. The most radical idea in 1789 wasn't liberty or equality. It was the belief that your daily suffering was not inevitable, that the world could be different. And when that idea takes root, even the quietest city becomes the loudest. By the early summer of 1789, the streets of Paris were changing not suddenly, but perceptibly, like water nearing its boiling point. Daily routine still continued. Bells rang, bread was baked, clothes were scrubbed on stone, but the rhythm had altered. More people lingered near printing stalls. Conversations became pointed, often heated. Crowds gathered more easily, dispersed less willingly. When a rumor took hold, it rippled through the city faster than the Seine itself. This final section explores the final days before Paris erupted, not through singular events, but through 1,000 subtle shifts: the slow collapse of deference, the rise of collective identity, and the transformation of desperation into action. The politics of hunger. By June, the cost of bread had reached its peak. It wasn't just about hunger anymore. People began to associate their suffering with systems, with tax laws, with nobles, with corrupt grain merchants, with the monarchy itself. Parisians had long endured famine and high prices, but now, for the first time, they had someone to blame. Some believed the aristocracy was hoarding grain to starve the poor and provoke rebellion that would justify repression. These weren't just paranoid fantasies. In an age before reliable news, disinformation traveled freely, often in the form of whispered warnings. A baron bought all the flour from the provinces. The queen dines on cream while we chew air. They're planning to poison the wells. The lack of trust in the crown and its ministers created a vacuum of credibility, which the revolution would soon fill. Book's ideas take root. Most Parisians didn't read Rousseau, Montesquieu, or Voltaire in their original forms. But they read paraphrased pamphlets, listened to readers in the square, or absorbed political ideas through street theater and satirical songs. The idea of natural rights entered tavern conversations. The phrase sovereignty of the people was painted on alley walls. Even the word citizen began to replace subject in popular speech. At Palais Royal, cafes were filled with people quoting speeches, misquoting them or inventing their own. Ideas once reserved for salons and academies were now spoken with greasy hands and soiled aprons. This wasn't pure enlightenment. It was enlightenment by fire fueled by need, emotion, and memory, not logic alone. Police-mail, the police and the people. The royal police in Paris walked a thin line. Officially, they kept order. In reality, they were often outnumbered, underpaid, and loathed. Surveillance was constant but ineffective. Informants listened at tavern doors. Agents tracked agitators at bookstalls. People were arrested for distributing illegal literature, but the pamphlets always returned. The police were not feared so much as resented seen as tools of the elite, not protectors of the public. And when violence erupted, they often stood aside. In June 1789, it became increasingly clear the police could no longer control the crowds. The ladder of protest. Revolution was not born in a single leap. It climbed step by step, each protest building on the last. Complaints to local officials. Crowds gathering to shout down landlords or bakers. Mock trials of corrupt nobles in marketplaces. Breaking windows, smashing carts, or seizing grain. Threats to tax collectors or clergy. Armed clashes, often brief, usually chaotic. Each rung made the next easier to reach. Each act of resistance, no matter how small, broke one more strand of fear. By early July, the Parisian crowd had grown confident, not organized, not uniform, but ready. Ready for something more than complaint, something permanent. Package the Bastille in the imagination. Even before it fell, the Bastille was more than a prison. It was an idea. Most people didn't know exactly what was inside. Some believed it held torture chambers. Others claimed it stored grain, weapons, or even treasure. In reality, by 1789, it held 7 prisoners and a garrison of old soldiers. But that didn't matter. The Bastille was a symbol of royal secrecy, unaccountable authority, and fear without trial. And when the king dismissed Jacques Necker, the finance minister, who seemed to side with the people on July 11, that symbol became a target. Within hours, Paris boiled. Balance the calm before the collapse. On July 13, shops began to close. Armed crowds seized muskets from the invalids. Blacksmiths hammered nails into pikes. Cannons appeared in the street. Yet even that night, some still hoped it might all pass. Parents urged their children not to get involved. Some priests called for calm in evening sermons. Bakers braced for theft, but left doors unlocked. But the dam had cracked. The next day, July 14, 1789, the people of Paris would gather outside the Bastille. Not with negotiation, not with delegation, but with powder, purpose, and blood in their eyes. Candle final reflection. To understand a revolution, it's not enough to study speeches and battles. You must also understand the ordinary days that came before the quiet injustices, the whispered ideas, the familiar streets walked by strangers who soon became citizens. The French Revolution did not descend like lightning. It rose like steam from boiling water, fueled by bread and boredom, anger and hope. Before the Bastille fell, Paris had already changed. Because once people believe that suffering is a choice, someone else's choice, it is only a matter of time before they knock down the door. Story 5. The Bastille, a fortress of fear or forgotten relic. It stood quietly in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, tucked between crooked lanes and old rooftops. 8 towers linked by thick stone walls, windows like arrow slits, heavy gates, a moat, no flags, no signs. To many, it was just there, a part of the Parisian skyline, like the spires of Notre Dame or the dome of Les Invalides. But on July 14, 1789, the Bastille became something more than a building. It became a legend, a rallying cry, and the first domino to fall in the collapse of the French monarchy. Yet before it fell, the Bastille had already passed its prime. So what was this fortress, really? And why did it matter so much to a people who hardly knew who was inside it anymore? The Bastille's origins, a fortress for kings. Construction on the Bastille began in 1357, during the reign of Charles V. Its purpose was clear: defense. Paris needed protection from English raids during the 100 Years' War. The structure was built to guard the eastern entrance to the city, commanding a key gate and the banks of the Seine. In its early years, it was simply called the Bastide, a generic term for a fortification. Over time, it became La Bastille Saint-Antoine. Its function evolved. After the war, it served as an armory, then a royal stronghold, and finally, most infamously, a prison. But it was not just any prison. It was a state prison where individuals could be detained by royal command, often with no trial, no charge, and no release date. The instrument of this detention was known as a lettre de cachet, a sealed letter from the king himself. It was the embodiment of absolutism. Locked with key, who went to the Bastille? The Bastille was never a mass incarceration facility. It held only about 40 to 50 prisoners at a time, often fewer. Its inmates were a mixture of noblemen who displeased the court, writers accused of sedition or immorality, Protestants during religious persecution, mentally ill individuals. The Bastille served in part as an asylum. Occasionally, common criminals, but these were rare. Some notable prisoners included Voltaire, who was twice imprisoned for his writings; the Marquis de Sade, who spent years behind its walls; Simon Nicholas Henry Linked, a lawyer who later wrote a memoir detailing the injustices of his imprisonment. Yet for all its notoriety, the Bastille was not a dungeon of torture and chains. By the 18th century, conditions had improved. Prisoners could often furnish their own rooms, order books, and even host guests with permission. Still, it remained a prison without process, and that, more than its walls, was what made it so feared. Chart decreasing, a symbol in decline. By the 1780s, the Bastille was a relic. Its military usefulness had waned. Its reputation had become more powerful than its reality. The prison held only 7 inmates on the day it was stormed. 4 forgers, 2 madmen, 1 nobleman held for family disputes. All were released that day, and quickly overshadowed by the myth. But while the Bastille was no longer central to the justice system, it still represented something far larger. Unaccountable power, secrecy, silence. It was the last place one might disappear to. Escape how the people saw it. To the educated and politically engaged, the Bastille was a metaphor. To the common people of Paris, it was a looming building, dark and strange, its purpose shrouded in rumor. Few had seen inside, fewer knew anyone who had. But everyone knew of it. They heard stories, some true, some exaggerated. Prisoners shackled in damp stone cells. Rooms with no light, no voices, no trial. Nobles bribing their way out. books banned and authors vanishing, screams echoing over the ramparts at night. In reality, the Bastille had not housed anyone infamous for years. But in politics, perception is often more powerful than fact. Cross the days before the fall. In early July 1789, Parisians were anxious and increasingly armed. The dismissal of Jacques Necker on July 11 shocked the city. He had been popular, seen as a moderate who might save the monarchy from its own excess. His removal suggested that the king might soon move against the National Assembly, and that force would follow. Crowds took to the streets. They seized muskets from the invalids, but without gunpowder, the weapons were useless. And the Bastille, it held gunpowder. That was the spark. The crowd didn't march on the Bastille to free political prisoners. They came for powder, arms, and proof that they would no longer obey. Candle-ending reflection. The Bastille did not fall because it was powerful. It fell because it had come to symbolize power itself, and all the injustice and opacity that power could conceal. It didn't matter that the cells were nearly empty, or that the warden, Bernard-René Delaunay, had no grand plan for repression. What mattered was what the people believed the Bastille to be: a place where the will of the king erased the rights of the man, a relic of a system that had ruled by secrecy, privilege, and silence. And when the people tore it down, they weren't just seizing gunpowder. They were destroying a stone emblem of fear. But what did they find inside? July 14, 1789, a Tuesday. The air over Paris was heavy with tension, the sky hanging low and thick over the city like a leaden curtain. In the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the neighborhood that pressed against the Bastille's stone walls, crowds gathered. They had spent the past few days arming themselves, pulling muskets from the invalids, hauling carts of grain, and muttering rumors of foreign soldiers and royal conspiracies. They didn't trust the court. They didn't trust the army. They didn't trust the king. And when the gates of political reform seemed to close, they turned instead to another gate, the towering fortress in the east. Firecracker, why the Bastille? On that morning, the Bastille held more than symbolism. It held 250 barrels of gunpowder, a treasure trove for a city preparing for siege. Paris was already in upheaval. The National Assembly had declared itself sovereign. Bread riots were erupting across neighborhoods. Royal troops, including German and Swiss regiments, loomed around the city's outskirts. Jacques Necker, dismissed from his role as finance minister, had fled the country, his exile seen as a warning that the monarchy was preparing to act. So the people acted first. Busts in silhouette, the crowd forms. By mid-morning, nearly 1,000 Parisians had gathered outside the Bastille. They were not a trained army. They carried muskets, pikes, axes, carpentry tools, and sometimes nothing at all. They were workers, apprentices, market boys, butchers, women, students, ex-soldiers. At first, they tried negotiation. A delegation approached the Bastille's governor, Bernard-René Delaunay, requesting that he surrender the powder and open the gates. Delaunay stalled, promised nothing, sent messengers back and forth. Meanwhile, the crowd grew. Cannons dragged through the streets by sheer manpower were positioned outside the gates. The fortress may have been ancient, but its walls were thick, and it was defended by about 100 men, mostly invalids, veteran soldiers, along with 32 Swiss mercenaries. It was not well supplied, nor particularly well commanded. But it was still armed, and it was still the king. Pistol the first shots. No one is entirely certain who fired the first shot. Perhaps it was panic, perhaps it was a misstep. But by early afternoon, the siege began. Gunfire echoed from the fortress towers. The crowd returned fire with muskets, and the occasional cannon shot. Smoke rose in white plumes over the walls. Bodies fell on the cobblestones, dozens of protesters struck down by musket balls. It was not a clean or coordinated assault. It was chaotic, loud, and fueled by desperation. A few guards were killed by stray fire. The defenders tried to hold, but they knew they could not win. Hourglass not done a fragile surrender. By late afternoon, the fortress walls still stood, but the situation inside was deteriorating. Delaunay was out of time. Rather than let the Bastille fall by force, he sent word that he would surrender on condition that the garrison would be spared. The gates were opened, the drawbridge was lowered, the crowd surged inside. What followed was not mercy. Delaunay was seized, beaten, stabbed, and dragged through the streets. When someone suggested taking him to City Hall, a voice reportedly shouted, "There is no use for him there." He was killed. His head was cut off, impaled on a pike, and paraded through the city. 3 other officers met the same fate. This was not justice by trial, it was justice by rage. Bricks the aftermath in the streets. Word of the Bastille's fall swept through Paris like wind through dry leaves. People cheered, wept, shouted, embraced. Church bells rang. Shopkeepers threw open their doors. Bread was given away. Wine flowed. And yet through it all there was a strange solemnity. Because the people knew, this was not the end, it was the beginning. The revolution had taken a shape. It had a day. It had a symbol. It had blood on its hands. And now it had momentum. Old key, the key to a new world. A few days later, the new mayor of Paris, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, wrote a letter to a friend in America, George Washington. Inside the envelope was an iron artifact, the key to the Bastille, pried from its gate and now repurposed as a gift from a newborn revolution to one that had just survived its infancy. Washington placed the key in a place of honor at Mount Vernon, where it still hangs today. Coffin the 7 prisoners. When the Bastille fell, the crowd expected to find dozens, maybe hundreds of political prisoners, dissidents, authors, secret nobles. Instead, they found a nobleman jailed for incest, 2 madmen later committed to asylums, 4 forgers serving sentences for financial fraud. They were confused, even disappointed. But the facts didn't matter, because the Bastille wasn't torn down for who was inside, it was torn down for what it represented. Candle closing reflection. The fall of the Bastille wasn't a military victory. It didn't change laws or depose a king that day. But it made revolution real. It told the people of France and the world that the ancient regime was no longer invincible, that a wall of stone and fear could fall when enough hands and voices came together. And though the fortress was ancient, what fell that day wasn't just rock. It was silence, obedience, and the assumption that power could not be touched. But after the dust settled and the pikes were lowered, a question lingered. Now that the people had torn down a fortress, what else would they tear down next? The afternoon of July 14, 1789 ended in smoke, splinters, and triumph. But as the crowds dispersed and the smoke lifted, the true weight of the Bastille's fall began to settle across Paris and far beyond it. This final section in the story of the Bastille is not about what happened, but about what it meant. The fortress itself was reduced to ruins, but in its place rose a new political world, still in its earliest stages, unsteady and uncertain. For some, the fall of the Bastille signaled liberation. For others, it was a warning. What had started as a demand for gunpowder ended as a philosophical event, a national myth, and a radical shift in the meaning of power. Bricks a fortress reduced brick by brick. In the weeks following the fall, workers began to dismantle the Bastille, not just symbolically but physically. A man named Pierre-François Palais, a self-proclaimed patriot entrepreneur, took charge of the demolition. He quickly saw the value in relics. Stones were carved into miniature Bastilles and sold as souvenirs. Chains and keys were melted down and recast as commemorative medals. Sculptures and fragments were sent to towns across France, spreading the myth of the fortress. Dust and rubble were even bottled and sold to collectors. The destruction of the Bastille became a form of public theater, a shared ritual in which the old order was reduced to pocket-sized keepsakes. It was the first modern political souvenir campaign, and it worked. Calendar Bastille Day, a holiday is born. Within a year, July 14th was declared a national holiday, La Fête de la Fédération, celebrated first in 1790, with a massive event on the Champ de Mars. Tens of thousands gathered to commemorate the unity of the French people and the promise of constitutional government. Even King Louis XVI attended, taking an oath to the Constitution in front of the people. In that moment, the revolution still seemed hopeful, a moment of reconciliation between the crown and the nation. But this harmony would not last. Future Bastille days would carry with them not unity, but layers of meaning: blood, defiance, memory, and the complicated legacy of revolt. Jigsaw: the Bastille and the Revolution's psychology. For many historians, the importance of the Bastille lies not in its strategic value, but in its psychological resonance. It was the first time the French people had physically seized a symbol of royal power. No decree, no petition, no speech. They took it. That act changed everything. It validated popular violence as a political tool. It emboldened radicals, who saw the event as proof that the people could and should rule. It terrified the monarchy, prompting Louis XVI to withdraw troops and recall Necker. It fractured moderates, many of whom feared the momentum they had helped unleash. After July 14, fear shifted, from the people fearing the king to the king fearing the people. Fire the Bastille in revolutionary propaganda. Almost immediately, the fall of the Bastille was mythologized. Pamphlets, paintings, and plays transformed the ragged, chaotic siege into a heroic, moral moment. Artists portrayed the Bastille as a dungeon of torment, even if that was no longer accurate. A dark tower of tyranny, split open by the light of the people's will. A giant toppled by the resolve of barefoot citizens. Even the 7 prisoners, largely unremarkable men, became momentary symbols of unjust confinement. The revolution had found its first monumental story, and it would never let go. Firecracker: the Bastille's political shockwaves. The fall of the Bastille sent shockwaves through France. In the countryside, peasants heard that Paris had risen, and they rose too. Manor houses were attacked, tax records burned, grain stores looted. In Versailles, Louis XVI was advised to flee, but chose to stay for now. In other European courts, monarchs stared in disbelief. Could this really happen in France, of all places? The question spreading through noble circles wasn't just what happened, it was, could it happen here? The Bastille proved that power built on fear and tradition could be dismantled literally. Counterclockwise arrows button a changing dynamic: the king and the crowd. 3 days after the Bastille fell, Louis XVI visited Paris. He wore the tricolor cockade, red, white, and blue on his hat. He was met by the new mayor Bailly and the National Guard, now commanded by Lafayette. The king smiled, he waved. But everyone knew what had happened. He had not come as a sovereign visiting his capital. He had come because he had no choice. From this point on, the monarchy would be reactive, not active, constantly responding to pressure from the streets, never again in full control. Chart decreasing: the end of the fortress, the beginning of the revolution. By the end of July 1789, the Bastille was already gone, but its fall was only the first drop in a much larger flood. In the months to come, the feudal system would be dismantled. The Declaration of the Rights of Man would be proclaimed. The king would be moved to Paris and later to the scaffold. But the emotional, symbolic center of the revolution always returned to that ancient stone fortress, brought down not by cannons or siegecraft, but by common citizens who refused to remain afraid. Candle final reflection. The Bastille didn't just fall, it was torn down by people who believed they had been forgotten. Its destruction was an answer to years of arbitrary arrests, censorship, hunger, and humiliation. It was proof that a wall, no matter how old or thick, means nothing if no one believes in it anymore. And in its place rose a single, irresistible truth. If the people can bring down the Bastille, then they can bring down anything. But what happens after a symbol is destroyed? What new structures will take its place, and who will build them? Story 6. Robespierre's Rise, the lawyer who out-terrorized the king. He was a small man with a high-pitched voice, prone to blushing, and suffered frequent nosebleeds. He rarely drank, never married, and lived in a modest room at the Duplay family home, surrounded by books and silence. His clothes were neat, his handwriting impeccable. His name was Maximilien Robespierre, and for a time he was called the Incorruptible. But how did this quiet lawyer from Arras become the master of revolutionary terror, wielding the power to send kings and commoners alike to the guillotine? To answer that, we must return to the beginning, to the slow, methodical rise of a man who believed in virtue, but found his place in violence. Adult Balance origins, the student from the north. Robespierre was born in 1758 in Arras, in the northern province of Artois. His family belonged to the petite bourgeoisie, respectable, educated, but far from wealthy. His mother died when he was 6. His father, a lawyer, vanished not long after. Orphaned young, Maximilien was raised by relatives. He was a gifted student, earning a scholarship to the prestigious college Louis-le-Grand in Paris, where he was trained in Latin, rhetoric, and the classics. Among his classmates was Camille Desmoulins, a future revolutionary journalist. Robespierre read Rousseau with fervor. He believed in the general will, in the moral improvement of mankind, and in a republic of virtue not through ambition, but through principle. He became a lawyer, returning to Arras to practice law. He was well liked, known for defending the poor and for challenging the abuses of authority, especially by the clergy and aristocracy. But he remained, by all accounts, unassuming. Until 1789. Classical entering the Estates General. In 1789, the crisis of the monarchy forced Louis XVI to summon the Estates General, a body that had not met in over 170 years. Robespierre was elected as a representative of the Third Estate from Artois. It was his first national role. He arrived in Versailles quiet and uncertain, but he found his voice among the growing tensions between the three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. Robespierre aligned himself with the radicals, those demanding a new constitution, abolition of feudal privileges, and representation by population. He spoke often, over 100 speeches in his first year, calm, precise, moralistic. He argued not just for laws, but for justice, the kind imagined in philosophy, not yet seen in politics. He believed that sovereignty resided in the people, not the king. Thread the National Assembly and the seeds of terror. As the National Assembly formed and began to strip away the monarchy's absolute powers, Robespierre gained traction. He opposed the death penalty, slavery in the colonies, discrimination against Jews and Protestants, the right of the king to declare war. But he supported universal male suffrage, free public education, the nationalization of church lands, the idea that virtue must guide the republic. To his peers he was both inspiring and exasperating. He refused compromise. He would not dine with elites. He was often alone. But his popularity grew, in clubs, in pamphlets, in speeches. Especially in the newly formed Jacobins' Club, where he became a leading figure. Megaphone voice of the sans-culottes. Outside the chambers of the assembly, Paris was changing. Bread prices soared, fear of aristocratic conspiracies spread, radicalism deepened. Robespierre, though not a man of the street, became the voice of the working poor, the sans-culottes. He called for price controls on grain, punishment for hoarders and profiteers, citizen militias to defend the revolution. He cultivated a reputation for austerity, a man who could not be bought. In a sea of shifting alliances, Robespierre remained unbending. That rigidity would become both his weapon and his curse. The Cold Turn, King, Trial, and Guillotine. By 1792, Robespierre had fully turned against the monarchy. He believed the king was conspiring with foreign powers to undo the revolution. When Louis XVI was arrested after attempting to flee in 1791, Robespierre insisted he must not only be removed but executed. This was not vengeance. For Robespierre it was logic. Louis must die so that the nation may live. The trial was long, the debates bitter, but in January 1793 Louis was guillotined. The Republic had crossed a line from reform to regicide, and Robespierre stood at the center of it. Candle reflection, the rise before the storm. At this point, Robespierre was not yet a tyrant. He was a man of ideals, still clinging to a vision of moral democracy guided by reason and equality. But the revolution was changing. Enemies, real and imagined, were everywhere. The Girondins, the moderates, opposed Robespierre's vision. Foreign armies were massing, royalists plotted, economic chaos threatened the streets. And Robespierre believed that only a virtuous citizenry could sustain a free republic. But what if the people were not yet virtuous? What if virtue had to be enforced? That question would shape the most terrifying phase of the revolution. What if the only way to build a republic of virtue was to rule through fear? The revolution had begun with speeches, dreams, and declarations. But by 1793, those dreams were drenched in blood. And standing calmly at the center of this violent storm was Maximilien Robespierre, still soft-spoken, still pale, still wrapped in a green coat and lace cravat. But now he held power, and he was no longer merely the incorruptible. He was a man willing to use the guillotine not reluctantly, but righteously as a political instrument. Brain a philosopher in power. Robespierre's idealism had not faded. If anything, it had intensified. He envisioned a republic of virtue, a state where laws aligned with morality, where corruption was punished, and where the citizen was elevated through education, civic duty, and sacrifice. But he also believed that this republic could not be built until its enemies were destroyed. As he famously put it, terror is nothing other than prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. This was not terror born of chaos. It was terror as policy, as duty, as purification. Gear the machinery of terror, the Committee of Public Safety. By April 1793, the revolution was under siege from within and without. Monarchist uprisings had begun in the Vendée. Foreign armies, Austrians, Prussians, British, were closing in. Inflation soared. Bread was scarce. Fear of treachery haunted every corner. To save the revolution, the National Convention created a powerful executive body, the Committee of Public Safety. It would be the de facto government of France. Its mission, protect the Republic at all costs. In July 1793, Robespierre joined the committee. He did not seize power. He was invited, even begged, to take it. Others trusted his incorruptibility, his clarity, his unshakable vision. But once inside the committee, Robespierre began to reshape the revolution in his image. Kitchen knife, the guillotine as governance. The guillotine, once a symbol of equality, all citizens, regardless of class, would die the same way, became something else under Robespierre, an instrument of national cleansing. Enemies of the people were everywhere, or so it was said. Nobles who hesitated, clergy who refused oaths, Girondins who wanted moderation, journalists who criticized policy, even former allies who veered too far or too slow. Trials were shortened, evidence became optional, rumors became reason enough. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, allowed for the arrest of anyone insufficiently enthusiastic about the revolution. The prisons filled, the guillotine quickened. Classical The Fall of the Girondins. Robespierre had long clashed with the Girondins, a group of moderate revolutionaries who feared the growing violence and centralized power in Paris. They supported the revolution but wanted limits. They opposed the execution of Louis XVI. They distrusted Robespierre's populism and feared mob rule. In June 1793, with support from the radical Jacobins and the Paris Commune, Robespierre helped orchestrate the arrest of 29 leading Girondins. They were tried, they were executed. The convention was now under the sway of the Montagnards, Robespierre's faction. The revolution belonged to the radicals. Fire the Terror begins. What followed was what history now remembers as the Reign of Terror. From September 1793 to July 1794, the government passed laws allowing for mass arrests, accelerated trials, and public executions. During these months, over 16,000 people were officially executed. Tens of thousands more died in prison, in uprisings, or were summarily shot. Entire towns like Lyon and Toulon were punished for rebellion. Children, priests, former generals, and ordinary citizens were sent to the scaffold. In Paris, the guillotine operated daily in the Place de la Révolution. Crowds gathered, vendors sold wine, heads fell. Robespierre justified it all. He rarely visited the executions. He did not relish blood. But in the cold calculations of civic virtue, he saw no alternative. Building virtue enforced, the festival of the Supreme Being. Though often labeled a dictator, Robespierre was not drunk on power. He was, if anything, drunk on moral certainty. By 1794, he turned his attention to remaking French society, even spiritually. The church had been dechristianized. Priests were exiled or killed. Churches had been stripped and turned into temples of reason. But Robespierre believed a republic could not survive without moral foundation. He proposed a new state religion, the cult of the Supreme Being. It was deistic, rooted in Enlightenment thinking, and intended to promote civic virtue, not superstition. On June 8, 1794, he led the Festival of the Supreme Being, parading through Paris in ceremonial robes, delivering orations, and proclaiming the dawn of a moral republic. To some, it was inspiring. To others, deeply unsettling. Even allies whispered, "Does he see himself as a prophet?" Detective the case of Danton and Desmoulins. Perhaps the most heartbreaking episode of Robespierre's rise was the execution of his friends. Georges Danton, once a towering revolutionary figure, began to call for an end to the terror. He believed the revolution had gone far enough. Camille Desmoulins, Robespierre's childhood friend, echoed the same call in his newspaper. Robespierre, unmoved, denounced them both as corrupt. In April 1794, Danton, Desmoulins, and their followers were executed. As Danton stood on the scaffold, he bellowed, "Robespierre, you will follow me." And Camille, he wept, begged, and screamed not for himself but for his wife and child. The man Robespierre once called a brother was now an enemy of virtue. Candle reflection. When does the revolution devour its own? By mid-1794, Robespierre stood at the height of his power. He had eliminated rivals. He was the voice of the convention. He was the architect of civic morality, the guardian of the people, the unbending spine of revolutionary purity. But he was increasingly isolated. Former allies feared him. Opponents plotted in silence. The people began to question the endless executions. And Robespierre himself had grown paranoid, withdrawn and suspicious. Still, he believed the Republic was almost born, that just a little more purging, a little more vigilance, and France would emerge pure, just, and strong. But history rarely bends to idealism without consequence. Because when a man believes only he can save the revolution, who will save the revolution from him? By the summer of 1794, Maximilien Robespierre, once the moral conscience of the revolution, had become its most feared figure. He had defended terror as virtue, guillotined kings and commoners alike, destroyed friends, and elevated ideology above affection, pragmatism, and even reason. But as the scaffold claimed more and more lives, a question echoed through the streets of Paris. Who would stop the man who claimed to be incorruptible? This is the final act of Robespierre's rise and his spectacular fall, the story of how one of the revolution's greatest champions became its victim. Cold eyes in the convention. Robespierre had never commanded armies, ruled as king, or worn a general's uniform. He had ruled through words, fear, and consistency. But in 1794, even his words lost their power. In May and June of that year, Robespierre intensified his vision. He proposed more executions, even of those within the convention. He named no names, but implied that many were guilty. He insisted that the Republic still harbored traitors in high places. This sowed fear not among enemies, but among his own allies. Deputies of the National Convention, once loyal, began to whisper, "If he has not accused me yet, he soon will." Classical the cult turned sour. The festival of the Supreme being on June 8, 1794, intended to unify the Republic under civic virtue, had the opposite effect. Robespierre presided over it like a high priest, dressed in blue and carrying ceremonial flowers. He delivered lofty speeches, proclaiming the dawn of a moral age. But many saw a man losing touch with reality, imagining himself a savior or prophet. Some whispered, "Is this Robespierre, or is this Cromwell?" The spectacle unnerved the convention. Even his loyal followers began to distance themselves. Kitchen knife the Great Terror. The month following the festival became known as La Grande Terreur, the Great Terror. In Paris, executions increased to dozens per day. Among the victims were aristocrats, revolutionaries, clergy, women including Madame Elisabeth, sister of Louis XVI, and ordinary citizens, condemned for words, silence, or mere suspicion. There was no longer any clear rule, just Robespierre's vision of virtue, enforced by the blade. By July, fear had turned to resentment. The convention plotted. Spiral 9 Thermidor, year II, July 27, 1794. The day Robespierre fell began like any other. He had not spoken publicly for weeks. Rumors spread that he was drafting another list, more names to be executed, more enemies of virtue. That morning, he gave a lengthy speech in the convention. He denounced conspirators within the government but refused to name them. This was a fatal mistake. "We are all on the list," a deputy whispered. "We must strike first." That afternoon, Robespierre returned to the convention. He was interrupted, shouted down, and eventually arrested along with his allies Saint-Just, Couthon, and his younger brother Augustin. Bricks the Hôtel de Ville standoff. Robespierre was imprisoned, but that night, he was freed by loyal National Guardsmen and taken to the Hôtel de Ville. There, he and his supporters debated their next move. They were armed. They could have marched on the convention, declared a new government, called on the people. But they hesitated. They argued, delayed. And the convention seized the moment. They outlawed Robespierre without trial. Troops were dispatched to arrest him. Around 2 a.m., they stormed the Hotel de Ville. In the chaos, Robespierre attempted suicide or perhaps was shot. His jaw was shattered, his mouth filled with blood. He was captured, half-conscious. He would never speak again. Chains, July 28, 1794. The guillotine turns. At noon the next day, Robespierre was dragged to the guillotine. He was not tried. He was declared an outlaw, along with 21 of his allies. His broken jaw was bandaged in bloody linen. His face, once composed and solemn, now twitched in agony. As he approached the scaffold, onlookers jeered. There is the bloodthirsty dictator. He cannot speak now. Justice at last. He died without a final word. Just hours earlier, he had held the fate of France in his hands. Now, his blood pooled with the thousands he had condemned. Chart decreasing aftermath, the end of the terror. The fall of Robespierre ended the reign of terror almost overnight. The prisons began to empty. The execution stopped. The convention reasserted control, abolished the committee's unchecked powers, and moved toward moderation. The revolution did not end, but it entered a new phase, one marked more by survival than idealism. Robespierre's legacy became a cautionary tale of purity turned punitive, of idealism corrupted by power, of a man who sought to save the Republic and nearly destroyed it. He was not the devil his enemies claimed, but nor was he the saint he believed himself to be. Candle final reflection. Robespierre's rise and fall remind us that revolutions often consume their own creators. He began with books and speeches, dreaming of liberty and virtue. He ended as a pariah, executed by the same mechanism he once praised as just. History asks not whether Robespierre was sincere, he was. It asks a harder question. When a man believes virtue must be enforced by fear, how long before fear replaces virtue altogether? The guillotine stopped, but the shadow it cast across French history would linger long after the incorruptible was gone.